All right. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody doing? How are those sandwiches? You got a thumbs up? Are they good? All right, all right. All right, well, my name is Kim Tabari, and I am the director of, what do? I am the director of organizational development and do a lot of external relations work with the Equity Research Institute. So excited to have you all here for our second Lunch and Learn series. So I want to open up just by acknowledging the land before we get started. So recognizing that California is home to Native nations on whose land we are living, and acknowledge that USC in particular is located on this Tongva land. We want to challenge the inaccurate narrative that the state was built by immigrants. Instead, we want to acknowledge that the land we reside on was taken by settler colonial society that exploited Native, immigrant, and enslaved people, stealing labor, knowledge, and skills to build on what we now call California. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free enslaved labor of Black people. We share these acknowledgements for three reasons. First, to pay respects to the original caretakers of the land. Second, to raise awareness about histories that are too often forgotten or erased. And three, to recognize our place in history, affirming our own commitment to social change. So let's take a minute to settle into our seats, feel your back against a chair, your feet on the ground, and just take a couple of breaths and bringing ourselves a little present. Thank you. It is my pleasure now to start off our conversation today with some poetry from Dr. Nusheen Valizadeh. I always call her Dr. V, so I don't have to say her last name that much. But many of the folks in the poetry world know her as Dr. V. She's an educator, spoken word artivist who recently published a book of poems entitled Woman, WOMXN. Please welcome Dr. V.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tabari. I'm so honored to be here with you all, and I'm so grateful that you just gave me that wonderful introduction. Dr. Tabari is someone who not only would take her shirt off her back, but literally took her belt off her dress for me today so that I could do this. So, yes, my book is called Women. The word woman, WOMAN, stems from the word wifman, wife plus man. So that's why the name of my book is Woman, with an X for intersectionality and solidarity with the unknown and the forgotten, stripped of their humanity. Women, because we can be non-binary, varying in ethnicities, races, abilities, and sexualities. Women, as in the women life freedom revolutionaries writing on walls in blood graffiti, Zan, Zindagi, Azadi. Yes, it's women against this mockery of a global society that portrays us as nothing when in fact we are everything. Women, because we are more than the wife of a man. So I have a poem for you all today. It's an excerpt of a poem about my first time that I got to go to Iran, which is where my family is from. And it's from my Women in Exile chapter in my book. And the reason I'm sharing that poem is because so much of the community engagement work that we do, so much of the social change work that we do, often the entry points are from the marginalized spaces and from really understanding what the oppressions are of the community so that we can actually combat them. But I do believe that there's a space that we can hold the joys, the celebrations, and the beauties of folks' communities, their cultures. So much of the arts that I've been able to bring into this work, I've been able to even smell what Edna's El Salvadorian kitchen smells like during the holidays. or even being able to explain what the Sims Library of Poetry not far from here feels like during Juneteenth, with all of the incredible Black poets that come, the drumming, the music, the food, and really get that type of spiritual experience. So when we're thinking about the communities we're engaging in, having some of that entry point also be, hey, take me to a place that I probably won't ever go, but make me feel like I was there. And that was the prompt that inspired this piece. So please, if you'd like, with the breath that Dr. Tabari was able to have us all take, feel free to go back to that place. Feel free to close your eyes, whatever makes you most comfortable, and come to my motherland with me. Nushin, Bia, come, my mother yells with smiling eyes. I shake my old leaves off, stepping into this delicious dream. My Chobe Nushin, I finally know the true meaning of my name in that saying. Until this point, I have suffered through 17 years of solitude. My heart, a deflated, faded red balloon consuming the helium of every culture, religion, and book I could get my hands on. And nothing has filled me until this moment, as I am met with over a dozen hugs and tears. Cousins, aunts, and uncles I have known only by telephone are now in the flesh, and I feel at home. My foot plants itself onto the rich, ancient soil. I imagine myself a seed growing roots into pomegranate trees before massacres compete for the hot oil beneath our feet. I steal a moment to envision a few historical things. Was this where Cyrus the Great replaced the shackles of slaves with wings? Where he found beauty in difference, liberating religion, and sanded prickly tongues with freedom of speech, elevating his diaphragm with his hands to Zoroaster, ruling on virtues thereafter, Pindorenik, Gofdorenik, Vakirdorenik. Good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Was this the home of Rumi, bravely writing his homoerotic poetry? While Khayyam tasted wine and Sa'di turned Sufi, has my blood been here for over 10,000 years? I pierced the ears of my neighbors across the seas. Poya nebad khak Iran ma. Long live the soil of our Iran. And I breathe it in. Somehow the pungent pollution of this new Iran is overpowered by sweet lemon trees. The breeze pushes its discarded seeds through every facial orifice and into the trunk of my body. As my arms danced into celestial branches, waiting to be squeezed of its nectar, quenching the thirst of my ancestral gods, suddenly I am hit with an epiphany. This used to be heaven. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. V, for sharing your words, your homeland, and you with us. Let's give her another round of applause. So I'm Jody Aegis Vallejo. I am Associate Director of Equity Research Institute, and I just want to thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today for this conversation. I'd like to thank our events team for all of your work. Where are you, events team? Somewhere in the back over there. And also our sponsors, including the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life, the Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies, the Center for Religion and Civic Culture, and the Levin Institute for the Humanities, and also Public Exchange. So at ERI, we use data and analysis to power social change. And one of the areas that we've been thinking about very, very deeply is how to strengthen collaborative research between academics and communities for equity-oriented change. And so it is an honor to me to introduce a leader at USC who has innovated new ways of fostering connections between academics and the communities, We are so honored to have our Dean, Amber Miller, with us today. She is the 22nd Dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Dean Miller holds the Anna H. Bing Dean's Chair. She has a faculty appointment in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and her signature initiative is the Academy in the Public Square, at the center of which lies Public Exchange, which I hope she's going to tell us a little bit more about. But Public Exchange connects universities and academics to civic and business leaders and has been instrumental in visioning forward collaborative community connections with academics. So please help me welcome Dean Miller.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to be brief because we want to get to the main event. But I just want to say it is truly my pleasure to join the Equity Research Institute for today's conversation on community engaged research. As those of you who know me know, this is near and dear to my heart. And the fact that USC has a strong tradition of this work is one of the big things that attracted me here in the first place. I know that you've heard me say many times that it is really important to me that the world starts to see research universities in particular in a different way, not just as producers of the next generation of students or as esoteric environments where research that no one really understands is produced, but as go-to places where the community can come for help solving really thorny problems and as really, truly engaged partners. As Dr. Vallejo said, we have built a number of different ways to do that under our Academy in the Public Square umbrella. And I don't want to spend a lot of time today talking about Public Exchange, but I do encourage those of you who don't know about it to please go look it up, because I think that that is something that I'm really hoping will get bigger and broader and will turn into a network of universities across the nation. And I had the great pleasure this morning of having a conversation with one of your panelists, Chancellor Cantor, about a different model that she and her team have been developing. And it was one of the best conversations I've had in a long time, because it was so much fun to hear someone else with the same goals and the same drive to really engage communities doing it in another way that has also been enormously successful. And to just see that we're not alone in trying to get this done, and that's really exciting. And the Equity Research Institute realized this goal a long time ago. Realized that opening the doors is not enough, and that we genuinely need to build real collaborations with our community. We can't be the imperial experts going around telling everyone how to do stuff. We need to be partners. And we do have faculty with real expertise that can be valuable to communities. And there is great value in listening to our communities and hearing what it is that they have to say and what it is they have to contribute, and figuring out how to work problems together as a team. And I think that is both what the ERI has been trying to do, what Chancellor Cantor's group has been trying to do, and what Public Exchange has been trying to do. So today, in this conversation, we are going to explore a number of different ways in which this kind of community-engaged research can be used to power social change. And we are going to hear from two of the world's experts. I almost feel embarrassed introducing Manuel Pastor in this group, but I'm going to do it in case we have people who don't know him. Embarrassed only because I feel like you all know him better than I do, probably. But just in case, he is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity. He holds the Terpangian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change, and directs, of course, the Equity Research Institute here at USC. Professor Pastor's research focuses on the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income urban communities and the social movements that are seeking to change those realities. He is a celebrated writer who has authored and co-authored 17 books. He has received millions in grant funding for innovative research, and he is frequently called upon by public media outlets for his expert analysis. He has been recognized with honors and awards by dozens of community groups and professional societies, including his recent election that we will be celebrating very soon to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He will be in conversation with Nancy Cantor, the Chancellor at Rutgers University in Newark. Chancellor Cantor is a celebrated social psychologist who explores how individuals perceive and think about their social worlds, their goals, and how we adapt our behavior in challenging social environments. She is also very interested in eliminating physical and social barriers between universities and communities, and has also been recognized with numerous professional honors, including the election into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. She previously served as the first woman chancellor at both Syracuse and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So I will now turn the program over to Professor Pastor and Chancellor Cantor, and thank you all again for joining us today.
Great, well, it's wonderful to be with you today. If you can't see us, sort of dodge between the heads in front of you. A couple of thank yous. Thank you, of course, to the ERI events team and staff for putting this together. Let's give them another round of applause. I also want to give a special thanks to Kim Tabari for lending her belt to a poet. And for every event we've got, Kim seems to have an endless supply of poets that she reaches out to, so really appreciate that. Thank you too to the Dean for the kind introduction. Normally, I just say that I've been married to the same woman for 42 years, and I think that's enough of an accomplishment for anything. I want to start this conversation. I was asked to frame things just a little bit about community engaged research and what we want to talk about today. And I want to start by something academics don't usually start with, one of my biggest mistakes. One of my biggest mistakes came when I moved up to UC Santa Cruz. Not living in Santa Cruz, that was kind of nice. But we were trying to organize a summer institute for transnational activists, people in Latino communities in the United States, people organizing in Latin America. And in the middle of one of the early organizing meetings, I talked about combining the intellectual resources of the university with the organizing resources of the community, which was, to use technical language, a stupid fucking thing to say. And the reason why is there's intellectual resources in the community. There's theorizing, there's hypothesis testing, there's leadership, not just in terms of activity, but in terms of thought. And so when we think about community engaged research, it's not just the university showing up with the resources, which we do have, but also showing up ready to learn, ready to listen, ready to accept leadership elsewhere. I also think that one thing to highlight is that there's a spectrum of community engaged research. There are many people who, for example, do community-based participatory research. They actually work with communities who collect the data, generate the hypotheses, and help to produce and write the studies. Another part of that, just probably closer to what ERI does, is listen carefully to the questions that people have and then bring data and GIS mapping and sort of high-tech tools to bear to assist in those insights, data and analysis to power social change. So I just want to be clear that when we say community engaged research, there's not just one type. There's the deeply authentic participatory research, there's assisting with technical expertise, and I know Nancy will talk a little bit about being a partner around being an anchor institution. The final thing I want to lift up as framing is about institutional transformation. For the last 15 years, ERI has existed at USC. As many of you know, we just had a quinceañera to celebrate our 15 years. And one of the things that we thought a lot about when we were doing that is that probably for a large portion of that 15 years, we imagined ourselves to be a guerrilla operation at the university. That is, to be truly engaged, but to not necessarily think that much was going to change at the university to really support that kind of work. And our associate director, Jody H.S. Vallejo, nailed it when she said 15 years ago, the university wasn't ready for ERI. And ERI wasn't ready for the university. That we weren't ready for a university that might welcome us. We weren't hearing, and now the university is hearing, about young scholars, graduate students who are insisting on relevance, and that we are at this moment of thinking about how we fit in and how we engage in authentic institutional transformation when we've got a dean who is supportive, when we've got faculty who are clamoring for it. So I think a lot of these issues will come up in our conversation. So I'm going to start with the first question that was scripted, because Nancy, when I told her I would ask her an unscripted question, said that she would never talk to me again. So I will let you know, though, what the unscripted question was, which you should probably try to work in, which is there was a conference at UC Santa Cruz called All In about institutional transformation, community engaged research. And there was a session there which had Nancy Cantor. And when it was done, Dr. Tabari and a few others came up to me and said, "Man, that woman is kick-ass. We've got to bring her to the campus. Do you know her?" Turned out we've known each other now for at least a decade. And so the question I keep wanting to ask is, what the hell did you say there? But let me start with another question, which is this journey to community-engaged research. It's an intellectual journey, but it's also a personal journey of understanding what's important, what gives our lives meaning, what's the role we want to play in a university. So, Nancy, I'm just so glad to be sitting with you, having this conversation. Can you talk a little bit about your journey to community-engaged research, to bridging the academy and the community, and to being a kick-ass chancellor? So.
Oh boy, I knew he'd spring it on me. Well, you know, one of the things I think Manuel and I really hold in common is that we're not just academics, we're people, right? So we come at this as people. So when I think about journey, I think about my family. I think about growing up in New York City, on the Upper West Side of New York City before it was fancy, I always have to tell people. I couldn't go near there now. And I grew up in a very activist family, but by the time they had me, they were insiders. So my father had been a major labor union organizer in the Midwest and was chased out by McCarthy, a period that many young people here may not remember, but he then, even though he had been so-called general counsel of the Farm Equipment Workers Union, he didn't have a law degree. So he went to Columbia and got a law degree, worked full-time, and had me. My brother was already born, and my mother then went and became a gerontologist studying ethnic urban poor elderly in New York for the city of New York. But they never lost their activist sense. So they were insiders in traditional places because they had to support a family and they wanted us to go to school and do well. But they were always sort of outsiders. So years later, I read Anita Hill's phenomenal op-ed in 2002, I think it was, called Insiders with Outsider Values. And that's what I see as both my journey and what really authentic community engaged work in a university needs to be. We need to be insiders to transform the institutions, but keep those outside values there to really remember the authenticity of what is valuable and what needs to be done. I then, and I'll go quickly, I don't mean to take too long on my journey. You should talk about your journey. I then did, to please my daddy, I did the traditional educational route. I was always a dancer. I thought I was going to be a ballet dancer. My back gave out. But I went to Sarah Lawrence because they had fabulous dance and I could watch it at least. And I had this great mentor and she said, you know, I did psychology at Stanford. Why don't you go apply there? And I said, oh, I don't do well on tests. I'll never get in there. Forget it. You know, she wrote to somebody who had been a mentor. He was an immigrant from Guyana and took me and said, we'll take you here. And I went in mathematical psychology. I mean, talk about, like, they didn't have girls in that. My first day in graduate school, I was in the elevator and this very prominent psychologist, tall guy, looks down at me and he says, who are you? And I said, I'm Nancy Cantor, I'm from Sarah Lawrence, I'm starting graduate school. And he said, we don't take girls from Sarah Lawrence. And I said, well, you did. So I say that again because I think it is important that the most important thing to me in community engaged work is that no matter what institutional role we have, and no matter how much we try to push the institutions, we can't lose the community base, the outsider values that we bring inside, or the work won't make a difference. And I think I have then faced, as all of us do, many challenges in institutions. My first job in my tenure was at Princeton, and when I got tenured, you could fit the number of women with tenure around the kitchen table of the dean, which we did. I then went to Michigan, and there were tons of senior women, not only in my field, but throughout the institution. And that taught me the lesson that numbers matter. Numbers really matter. They're necessary, they're not sufficient, but critical mass really matters. So when we do community engaged work, when we pursue the value of diversity in our institutions, when we think about social change, we can't just have the isolated individual or the isolated researcher or the isolated project. We have to have critical mass to make a difference. Otherwise, those outsider values won't speak out. I then learned, and I'm going to stop in a minute, the hardest lesson of my career. I went, after putting together the affirmative action cases for Michigan as provost, I went to be chancellor of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. They wanted me for my work on diversity, supposedly. That's what the trustees told me. Well, they had
Until you got there, right? So.
They had a fake Indian mascot called Chief Illinois. And I worked with the broad indigenous community in Chicago to get Illinois to get rid of the Indian mascot. Well, good luck. And I learned the lesson that some institutional contexts and histories don't change. So I got out of there. The NC2A then told them they wouldn't have, what do you call those, competitions at Illinois if they didn't get rid of the mascot, and they got rid of the mascot. So I learned the lesson of politics, but I learned the lesson of institutional context. And I think that's really something important for all of us to remember. I'm now in the most wonderful city in the face of the earth, other than LA, in Newark, New Jersey, where resistance and resilience is the name of the game. The name of the game, and has been for decades and decades. Generations of migration and immigration, assets that create an amazing community, and of course, the brunt of systemic racism coming together. And I love the poetry. I love the land acknowledgement. It's those assets that we have to bring to the table. Is that enough of a journey?
Boy, I have so many questions now. I want to start with two, and then we'll jump to the ones that are on the script. When people ask me why I love Los Angeles, I say it's because it's got the world's biggest problems. And it makes it this terrain for organizing, social movements, imagination about how to build a better world from the ashes of rage, from the terrain of exploitation, to imagine something completely different. That seems like how you love Newark. Can you say a bit more about why you love Newark?
So I love Newark for two polar opposite reasons. One is what you've just said. Newark is a fighting city. I remember I was sitting with the mayor, and he was giving the mayor, who's the son of Amiri Baraka, amazing activist, late poet, and I was sitting with Raz Baraka, and he was celebrating, I think it was like the 50th anniversary of the Newark rebellions. And he said, you know, they call it riots. Riots are for football games. Rebellions are for people who know that it can be better and different. Yeah. I mean, I remember just feeling this is a city where the people are organized to make a difference. The other piece of why I love Newark is that you see the assets of a diverse community. I mean, I get very frustrated when the Academy simply describes communities from a framework that I call a deficit framework of challenge and problems. No question, challenge and problems are there at no fault of the community as a result of systemic racism and discrimination for centuries. But that's not the framework for communities. The framework for communities is there's huge resilience and assets. We have this amazing program at Rutgers-Newark called Lives in Translation, which takes the 50+ home languages of our students and creates internships in immigration law clinics, and they did COVID contact tracing for the city of Newark because they have the asset of not only the language, but the history behind it. Exactly what you were speaking of, I think. And when you can be in a place where the assets are spread across a variety of intersectional communities, and you can bring that to the curriculum, you can bring that to the social change that needs to be made, then you are not only giving ownership to change, and the academy is not so good at giving ownership to others, right? Think of our trademark world, right? We don't give ownership to others. We don't share ownership. Well, if we're going to do good community engaged work, we have to start with the view that the assets are there, and therefore the ownership of change is there. I get so frustrated when universities talk about students as rising above adversity and coming to us, or when the community is seen as receivers of our knowledge, not knowledge makers in partnership. I don't want a student who rises above adversity. I want a student who tells me what the world really is out there and has the insights to do it. We run a very large prison education program in all the major maximum security prisons in New Jersey, and I gave the commencement address in what is the god-awful Edna Mahan Women's Maximum Security Prison about a month ago to our students inside who had gotten bachelor's degrees. And let me tell you, their senior thesis on trauma from the outside and trauma from the inside taught me as a psychologist more than I could ever know from just reading and writing and telling. I don't think that answers your question.
No, but I'm just fascinated. So I think all of you are. And it really kind of slips into this issue of, well, there's just so many things, but what do you think are some of your learnings along the way? But the one comment I'll make about what you just said is the following. One thing I've banned from my language is the term disadvantaged.
Right.
Because just like, I have a voice condition, which you know,
Right.
it's pretty random, it's a disadvantage. There's a difference between that and structurally disenfranchised and disempowered.
Exactly.
Where the disadvantage is a bug, structural disempowerment is a feature of a racist, classist, and exclusionary system. And lifting that up, I think, is important. Anyway, that's inspired by what you said. But can you talk a little bit about what you've learned about the ways in which universities can contribute positively to community engagement? You've talked a little bit about shifting the frame to assets. Implicit in something you said was also universities as conveners, because to some extent we have often god-awful histories, but we can also play a neutral role. What are the things that universities can and should do?
So I have a bunch of things that I think universities can and should do, and that are lessons, really, from decades of trying to do this work as you have been. Not the least of which is space is really important. So when we convene here or there. We have to do what I call a third space. We have to find that space, that place, that actually is a place of co-creation. That means a lot of honesty about putting positionality and power on the table. But I'm a strong believer that civil infrastructure, place, actually is something that then creates social infrastructure. I did some years and years ago, some advising to the National Science Foundation's engineering directorate of all things. They wanted a social psychologist to come in and tell them how to get legitimacy in communities for civil infrastructure they were building. And I said, what's civil infrastructure? Give me your definition. They said, large things attached to the ground. I said, that's a scientific definition, large things attached to the ground. Okay. But it has really stuck with me. So in every place I've been, we have created in community third spaces, literally large things attached to the ground. In downtown Newark, there was a building 30 years empty. And then it was being renovated by Prudential and by a real estate company, and Whole Foods was coming in. And that was going to be great. Okay. But I said to the CEO of Prudential, how about Rutgers-Newark builds a university community arts collaboratory in 50,000 square feet in that space, where university and community, artists and children and senior citizens and faculty and students can create, co-create. Well, that has turned into this amazing space of problem solving, of creation, about climate inequality. The Humanities Action Lab is there doing its climate, you know that network, doing its climates of inequality work. Third spaces are really important. Third spaces capitalize on the notion of what my dear friend Harry Boyd said, which is universities will never do good work if we continue to be the cult of the expert. The dean said something similar. So third spaces allow you to have a community of experts with and without pedigree who come together. And then it allows you to do what you do, which is to take the outside-in perspective on what should be studied, right? So we run a community policing collaborative. We're the backbone organization for the Newark Public Safety Collaborative that has the police and grassroots community-based organizations, the Newark Community Development Network, sitting at the table with our criminal justice scholars who feed data on not who's doing crime, but where crime is occurring, what are its characteristics, vacant lots, unlit ATMs, etc. And then the community grassroots organizations and the police, God forbid, sit together and create interventions. We call it data-informed community engagement. But what really turned it on its head was that the community would then ask for the data they wanted.
Yeah.
And we could produce it. And I know you've done that many, many times. But I think that is absolutely critical. We are so used to going in and saying, here's what I'm going to tell you about your community. You've got a toxic waste dump there. Don't build a community garden there. They look at us like, yeah, we live in food apartheid. You think we don't know? You think we don't know? What they want is to tell us what the real landscape is, and then how our data, and it's not that we're irrelevant. The thing I love about it is that then you are incredibly relevant and treasured by the community that used to be incredibly suspicious. I mean, I almost faint every time I see the recordings of the Newark Public Safety Collaborative and watch the chief of police in a city under a consent decree sitting with the Newark Community Development Network that arose out of the rebellion and sitting with criminal justice faculty feeding data. I'm like, wow, can we keep this going? And that's the final thing I would say. Well, I have a lot more, but I won't say. That I would say on that, which is sustainability of these things. The real lesson, I think, of this whole thing is that you cannot do one-and-done projects. You can do one-and-done projects, and they can be very important. So I shouldn't say you can't do one-and-done projects. But for anchor institution work, for it to be genuinely trusted, a genuine trusted democratic partner, you have to pay as much attention to the sustainability of the collaborative infrastructure that you create as to the project and its particular outcomes. And part of that reason is it's always one step forward and 20 steps back. It's never linear. It's never one and done if you really believe that you're going to dismantle systemic racism and its entrenched embodiment in the environment.
So I'm going to ask you, I have so many questions again. The one I will ask you about what is an anchor institution for some folks who don't necessarily know what that is. But before I do, can you, in this work, describe a moment of joy or maybe of searing pain, but of joy? I keep thinking for me as you're describing this, we wrote a book, it came out a couple of years ago, South Central Dreams. And the number of young folks in South LA who come up and say, wow, nobody ever wrote me into a book. I've never really seen myself fully portrayed. And that felt more than any kind of academic achievement. I was joking with you, both of us did get elected to the American Academy, but when I got the email about it, I thought it was phishing, because I had no idea what the American Academy was, having grown up working class. Then when I found out what it was, I was like, no way that's me. But having somebody come up and say, I see myself in what you did, that's such joy. What brings you joy in this work?
So riffing off of you, the first thing I would say is, what really brings me joy in Newark is when they look at this little white girl and they actually trust me. And then I feel like I'm back in that subway in New York City, going 45 minutes on the subway to school. This little thing surrounded by so many different cultures and languages and people. And I kind of was a part of that. And I never was fully a part of the academic institutions, even though I was the star.
Yeah.
So what really brings me joy is imagining, honestly, that Rutgers-Newark has now become a trusted agent, a trusted anchor. And people want to send their children to us. So we've got for the last 10 years, we've got a huge commitment to enrolling the residents of Newark at Rutgers-Newark. We do FAFSA workshops in multiple languages in all the public libraries in Newark. Our poets team up with our jazz artists and do in every public library community-based moments of storytelling and jazz poetry. That's the joy. I mean, the joy is that they let us in and that they really feel that we've opened the, quote, ivory tower back. And then the other joy that I really see is when our young faculty and graduate students, postdocs, want to do this work. Because, you know, we ain't gonna be around, well, you're young, but we ain't gonna be around.
I am not that young.
And it's really critical that there's the next generation. And that the next generation looks like the community. And when I look at those Lives in Translation students sitting in the immigration court, if you've ever been in an immigration court, it's like being in the maximum security prison. And they are sitting there and translating in a way that upends the practices of white supremacy in those courtrooms. That gives me joy.
It gives me joy to hear that that gives you joy. And I want to ask you a question, which is, how do we get more joy? And that is, how do we transform these university institutions so that they generate and support more authentic engagement, more relevant research, more people in the public square? It seems like every incentive we've got is turned against that. I remember I was in UC Santa Cruz. It was interesting, and we would set up our promotion cases, and on the service, we'd always include stuff about community service, and the university would say, "Why did you put that in? That's just completely irrelevant. We're talking about university service." We said, "Because it's valuable to us, and we're going to keep doing it because we don't care what you think." 4 or 5 years later, turned out UC Santa Cruz changed its rules and started requiring a statement about community service. So it's kind of an interesting way to push. But so many incentives are lined up to produce an article published in the Journal of Irrelevant Results rather than a community engagement. What do we need to do to make our universities work to support this kind of work?
You just said it all. So, no, seriously, I think one of the most important things we need to do is to really reform, revolutionize, whatever you want to call it, the tenure and promotion system. When I was at Michigan, we started a national network called Imagining America, Scholars in Public. I forgot the full title now. I always call it IA, I don't know. We just had our conference in Providence, and it's huge now. And we did what we called a tenure team study of what it would take to really get institutions to recognize the value of not only publicly engaged scholarship, but collaborative work and interdisciplinary work. If you think about those three things, what they have in common is they take a long time to produce outputs. And what they also have in common is that typically the outputs are not always the book for the humanist. I had a case, a phenomenal scholar, going up for full professor at Rutgers-Newark, and the central committee was questioning her because she hadn't done her second book. She had done a ton of articles because she was doing humanities work on reparative justice and reparations. And that takes time, right? So one is how you really revolutionize the tenure.
Yeah.
The second is related, which is this is not service. I am adamant about the importance of getting over the charity model that universities use to frame this work. It is not service to the community when it is co-creation with the community.
Yeah.
When you are an anchor institution in and of the community. And it takes a lot to be of the community. It is not service. Because if you do it as service, you sideline it to not be scholarship, to not be curriculum, to not be central to what the institution is supposed to be about. We can't do that. And the third quick thing I would say, I said, I think earlier, is numbers matter. So we need cluster hiring, not just put some person of color in some department to do community engaged work. You really think they're going to succeed? Come on. Well, they might transcend adversity and succeed. We need a takeover. Right?
Yeah.
We need numbers. I mean, it's so critical, and it's so hard to get people to understand that. And then the other thing I would say, and actually USC, Adriana Kazar is a scholar at USC doing work on what is called the shared equity leadership model. Everybody has to have this as part of their job. We can't have these things in isolated corners, even in isolated centers and institutes. And I'm a big fan of centers and institutes. I've done it at Rutgers. We have a ton of them doing all this anchor work. But they can't be isolated. It's got to be central to the mission of the institution. So everybody has to care about that.
Well, you actually just answered my first question, which is why did my staff think you were such a kick-ass chancellor? Because you were bold enough to talk about takeover. I want to, we'll come back to some other stuff, but I want to give a chance to the audience. I did want to say, before we turn to the audience, that this is a person, Nancy, who is capable of experiencing both deep joy and deep pain and empathy. You and I spent some time in Oakland with incarcerated youth, and we were moved by what they had to say, but I was moved by how in touch you were with how the world was closed down on them and on their hopes. And I think we sometimes think about joy and pain as being separate motivations, rather than understanding that the way that we come to this work of change is not because you took some great class in Marxist economics when you were an undergraduate, although if you took my class, that might be a good reason. But because at some point, either we experience the pain of seeing ourselves or our parents or our friends discriminated and excluded, or seeing an ally who was meant to suffer, and we knew that we had some privilege that we could bring to bear to make that different. And I think pain and joy in the service of change, they come together. Let's give Nancy Cantor a gigantic round of applause. Now, we're going to do Q&A in a way that's a little bit different, although it will involve what Kim is about to do, Dr. Tabar is about to do. But first, you've been sitting for a while, stand up, stretch. It's always a good thing to do. Find someone you don't know or don't spend a lot of time with. Take a few minutes. From that conversation, what struck you, what resonated, what's missing could have been said, what question are you dying to ask? What resonated, struck you, what's missing could have been said, what question are you dying to ask? Find somebody, introduce yourself, talk for a few minutes, then we'll explain why we did that before we do Q&A. Talk, quick.
I hope that this was absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. And I'll follow up. Yeah. Thanks for this intro.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Ready for the practice.
I know. But basically it's the same.
The basic principle and the top value is the same as how you achieve
Yeah.
tolerance and principle. The same thing, very much. Very, very similar. Both in family structure as well as your responsibility to the elder of the past and your responsibility for the generation of the future.
And responsibility yourself.
Very much.
Yeah.
Very much.
That's very
It's like,
important.
it's like when somebody's in Asia and they say to leave the place, you don't understand what it means. Only Japan, China understands what losing face means. They don't respect yourself. They don't respect your surroundings, community. You believe you become estranged. Anyway, that's very, very important. So, I think what is missing you're patient. You're patient. You're patient. And you are.
They don't like the patience.
Huh?
They don't like
They don't have. It's not that they don't like it. They have not installed to respect it, to value it. So they don't know what it is. They think it is a weakness. Whereas you and I, we think, oh, it is a strength. Because why? So it's all as a function of the value. And I think that's what and I think this is a major misunderstanding.
just like inside the value from the outside.
Just about a minute more, 1 minute more.
Correct, but they're talking about outside, not family. Outside, different community.
They have to listen.
So, from that perspective,
It takes time.
it takes time and it takes some common value.
But they are very important to speak out. Everything, everywhere. But it's hard to do that after
All right, everybody, thank you so much for the conversation. Grab a seat. Thank your partner. I Okay, this is not a pickup situation, but feel free to ask for the person's phone number or email so you can follow up and build intentional community, you know what I'm saying? All right, so does anybody have a question? My conversation was really good with my partner, but anybody got some burning questions? I see some hand in the back. I'm coming to you. Wait, I'm gonna go to him first and then you.
Well, first off, thank you, Nancy and Manuel, for this great conversation and engagement. My name is Damari Parker, Center Supervisor for our Center for Black Student Cultural Affairs with our cultural centers and SCIP on campus. And our burning question is, can you define what you meant by anchor institutions?
Great question.
Thank you.
So we think of anchor institutions as institutions that are literally anchored in community. They're not going to just up and leave. They are, in that sense, an anchor in the community, but willing to be a trusted democratic partner in and of a community. So there are a lot of large corporations or museums or educational institutions or hospitals that are relatively anchored in their community. But they're not necessarily anchored institutions unless they define that as part of their DNA, if you will, that it means to be of the community and make a difference in partnership with the community. So, for example, in Newark, I co-chair what we call the Newark Anchor Collaborative that has 17 large anchors. Everything from Prudential to Audible to every hospital to each educational institution to the Museum of Newark to the New Jersey Performing Arts Center to the park system. And we literally sit together and form a community of practice to, at the mayor's request, to, for example, figure out what it means to hire local people, what it means to have students who are local, what it means to serve as a hospital in and of the community, what it means to procure locally, to support local Black and brown businesses in Newark. And by acknowledging that we are anchor institutions, we then have to take a framework on ourselves about what it would mean to transform the institution in order to reach those goals. So it's that recursive, if you will, process that makes us, and we fill out each year a racial equity assessment framework for our institutions. You got Prudential, got Audible, filling out racial equity assessments about what they are doing in and of the community in Newark. There are different ways to be an anchor institution. Most anchor institutions start thinking of themselves that way in a one-on-one sort of way. So they make a partnership with a community organization or with City Hall over something. But increasingly, anchor partnerships are forming where it's more than just one institution. Anyway, I could go on about that because I spend half my life on anchor institution stuff.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you so much for the topic. My background is engineering, and I have been battling with what is my community ever since my teenager age. And I have been dedicated to science, but now for the past 2 or 3 decades, I have been involved in the social aspect. I have a fundamental issue with the topic of community engagement. Without common values, without common human values, it may result into entitlement. Equity means other people cannot understand you unless they are from the same culture as I am or the same color as I am. I have a problem with that, understanding that. Let me give you an example. After all this year, I live in a city called City of Rolling Hills. 740 houses, gated community. The biggest topic of discussion is whether we and it's gated. We have all the gated staff, everybody. The discussion is whether we need to have armed service or not. And if you walk to the east, it's San Pedro. It's a different community, different perspective. So when a community goes like that, then almost takes me back to equal but separate. Yeah. Then communities start to be entitled because this is what we want. Whereas as the leaders, educators, we should look at the humanity values, the higher values. That's why I have a little bit hesitation to embrace this community engagement, because I live in a community that when I attend every single board meeting, association meeting, I'm the one guy, I have to be shut down 10 times. Because the values they represent for that community, it's not the value that I want or I respect for my community. I see how passionate you are about Newark.
And I want to make sure we get one more question in, so let's hand it back to Kim. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to say a word about that?
You know, I think you're raising a really critical point, which I take to be, what is community? How do you define the community, right? And I'm a social psychologist. I do work, for example, on intergroup dialogue. And the notion of intergroup dialogue is that you can have both intra-group and intergroup at the same time. And I think the last thing in the world we want is gated communities. But we can also recognize that there needs to be a sense of community among people who have been disenfranchised from power and place. Redlining in this country has created communities, whether we like it or not. And so if we're gonna really understand the restorative justice, the reparations that come post-redlining and predatory lending and school segregation, then we need to understand what the organic community is and not break it up, but intertwine and have intersections.
Thank you, Nancy. I know we're low on time. We have a lot of hands going up, so I think I have time for 2 more.
Thank you so much, Kim. Thank you for such a wonderful conversation. My name is Esme. I'm a postdoc at the Equity Research Institute. I see myself as a junior scholar and an academic. I've always wanted to be a professor, a teacher, an educator before I really knew what it was and all the politics that surrounded it. And I see myself very much as an insider with outsider values, not just in the type of research I want to do, but in how I want to interact with students in the classroom. And I think that there could be a lot of risks associated with that, but I know there are rewards and benefits long term. Can you provide any encouragement, advice, and support?
Yeah, I really want to provide encouragement. And I always feel a little hesitant because I come across as if I'm so critical of the academy. And yet it's home, right? It is what, so you gotta fix your home, right? So here's the biggest advice I have is peer mentoring. Because the worst thing about the academy, in my view, is the received wisdom from above. When I had my first job at Princeton, the senior social psychologist said, I was being asked to be a woman on NSF panels, right? And he said, "Oh, don't do that. Write your own grants. It's a waste of time." If I had listened to him, I wouldn't have made any of the kind of social capital network that then allowed me to feel like I could be that insider and still be myself.
So find other insiders with outsider values. And don't always, I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't listen to Manuel, but don't always look for the sort of traditional advice. It's often going to be just put your head down, do it by yourself, write your own book, do your own study, get your own grant. Don't mess with that stuff. And my problem with that is then you're not yourself. You're not getting the rewards of making a difference. So yeah, there's got to be a balance. You got to get promoted. You got to do, but you know, don't lose why you're in it. In order to be in it.
And I have to add to that as one of our advisors.
Sorry.
No, I think it's totally consistent because I am a working class kid with immigrant dad who was undocumented, mom who grew up in Spanish Harlem. She was born in the United States. Was not tracked to go to college. When I decided to go to graduate school, because of political motivations, said, I'm going to go to a Marxist economics program because that sounds like a really good career choice. And pursued this engaged research my entire career. And, you know, it's worked out.
Yeah.
It's worked out. And I think if you choose the thing you love, you will become good at it. And if you choose the thing for careerism, you will be corroded inside in terms of your soul, and you might even be quote unquote successful, but you're never going to be as good at it as the thing you love and care about.
Yeah.
Last question from our other postdoc.
I just want to add, we have a saying at ERI, find your people.
Right, right.
I love what you shared, Chancellor Cantor. Something I'm thinking about is, in the university setting, I think funders and people in power within these massive, powerful institutions love the idea of people who ascend beyond their adversity because it means that they've adopted the norms and cultural expectations of the institution, and it makes them very marketable, and it gives the institution its lasting power, right? So if you're saying we should do away with that, and I totally agree, how do you drag your funders and your people on the board of trustees and those in power with you to engage in this change in a really lasting way?
So that's the multi-million-dollar question, right? And I wouldn't say that I'm great at that. So I'll give you, I think that the one thing that I have found surprising is that local place-based anchor institution work, for example, often brings very odd partners to the table who give it a kind of imprimatur that you wouldn't expect, right? When Audible and Prudential are sitting at the table, I can propose stuff that never in a million years would I imagine I could propose, because the Board of Trustees or the Board of Governors knows that they're collaborating with us. So, one of the things I think the Academy does wrong is it does a lot of inside to outside. So it's as if we create the norms, the practices, the things that are good to do, and then we tell the outside this is what we're doing and what we're rewarding. I think sometimes getting peculiar partners at the table is actually really helpful. I don't know if that addresses it, but the one, and I know we have to end, but the one other example I would give on that is when I was putting together the affirmative action cases at Michigan that the charming Roberts Court has now overturned, I never, ever in a million years expected that Justice O'Connor would write the opinion she wrote. And we realized after the fact She wrote that opinion because we had a military amicus brief and corporate amicus briefs. The military was saying, we learned our lesson in Vietnam, whether one believes that or not, and that is that we couldn't have all white leadership and all enlisted people of color. She listened. And the odd thing in the Roberts decision, if you look at it now, is he gave an exemption to the military. So the military academies can use race in admissions. The rest of the world can't. That's not coincidental. It's because the structure of supremacy is structured around some of those outside agents, if you will. And I'm not saying that they collaborate for the wrong reasons. They're actually collaborating right now for the right reasons. But we wouldn't normally think of them as partners. And I think that matters. I mean,
yeah. So, a couple of things to bring us to a close. I think what your question lifts up is the need to change the story from beating the odds to changing the odds. That we celebrate individuals rising above adversity rather than movements that change the terrain.
Right.
And that speaks to the kind of research we need to do and the stories we need to tell. The second thing is that it's on Nancy, it's on me, it's on people a little bit further along to be changing those dialogues. One of the things we're the proudest of at ERI is some of the whispering we've done to foundations.
Right.
Persuading the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to invest
Right.
$90 million in community organizing,
Right.
in persuading one of the sponsors for today, the California Endowment, to put in $2 billion over the next 10 years in building a lasting infrastructure for social movement organizing in California. And I think it's important for those of us who are a couple of the first ones through to remember the doors should be open, the rules should be changed,
Right.
the incentive structure should be shifted so Hesine finds her way without questions. It's all about you, Hesine. So I want to close by first thanking our team that put this together, Kim Tabari, Paris Valoria, who I think is probably hiding some. She's right there. Lift your hand. Deborah Gada, lift your hand, please. Jody Aegis Vallejo, thank you. And Eunice Velarde Flores in the background. Our managing director, Rondo Ortiz, lift her hand as well. And of course, people have done a bunch of stuff that I'm sure I forget. We also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Center on Technology, Science, Technology, Public Life, Center for Religion and Civic Culture, Latinx and Latin American Studies, the Levin Institute for the Humanities, Public Exchange, and our funder, who we keep trying to persuade, the California Endowment. But most of all, let us thank Chancellor Nancy Cantor. And Kim will be proud that we're only 1 minute late. Thank you very much.